Bang! The giant gates of the Worthington mansion slammed shut like a prison door. Cordelia stood on the wet curb next to 3 old boxes, her entire life. Her father watched from the window with a cold heart. He had just kicked his own daughter out because she promised to marry a man who didn't have a penny to his name, a man who couldn't even pay for a bus ride home. The rain hadn't decided if it wanted to fall properly yet. It just hung there, a cold mist that settled into the collar of Cordelia's coat and worked its way to her skin. She didn't move. She stood on that curb for a long moment, staring at the iron gates, at the crest welded into the center of them. The Worthington family crest, the 2 lions, and the crown. She'd walked through those gates 10,000 times in her life. She'd come home from school through those gates. She'd driven out through them on prom night, nervous and beautiful. She'd pushed her late mother's wheelchair out through them for Sunday walks when she was still well enough. Now they were closed to her, locked. And her father was watching from the study window on the 2nd floor. She could see his silhouette. He didn't move either. He was like a statue, arms folded, jaw set. She picked up the first box. It was heavier than she expected because she'd packed her books first, and books are always heavier than you think they're going to be. The cardboard was already wet on the bottom. She picked it up anyway, pressed it against her hip, and started walking toward the bus stop at the end of Ashgrove Road. She didn't look back. She wanted to. Every step she took, there was a war happening behind her eyes, a screaming, clawing part of her that wanted to turn around, pound on those gates, beg. Tell her father she'd made a mistake. Tell him she'd come to her senses, that she'd call off the whole thing with Thaddeus and come back inside to the warmth and the marble floors and the smell of Mrs. Pemberton's good cooking. She kept walking, because Thaddeus had once told her something, sitting on a park bench, sharing a bag of roasted peanuts between them because they couldn't afford a proper lunch. He'd said, "Cordelia, whatever you choose it all the way. A half-chosen life is the saddest thing I know." She was choosing all the way. Wait, you're telling me she threw it all away for a guy who can't even afford a bus ticket? Welcome back to the channel. Before this heartbreaking journey begins, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Let's go back 3 weeks, because you need to understand how this all started. You need to see the dinner table. You need to see her father's face when Thaddeus sat across from him. Cordelia Worthington was 28 years old, and she'd spent most of her adult life doing exactly what was expected of her. She'd gone to the right university. She'd come back and taken a position at Worthington and Crane Holdings, her father's company, as a corporate acquisitions analyst. She wore the right clothes. She attended the right charity events. She smiled at the right people and kept her opinions clean and careful. She was, by every external measure, the perfect daughter. And then she met Thaddeus. She met him at a bus stop, of all places. Her car had broken down. Well, it's not her car. She didn't have one. Her father always sent a driver. But the driver was late, and she'd had a meeting across town that couldn't wait. So she'd taken the bus for the first time in probably 7 years, and she'd stood at the stop on Clement Street, not quite knowing where to put herself among the ordinary rush of people. He was sitting on the bench with a paperback novel, wearing a jacket that was clean but visibly old, the kind that had been washed so many times the color at the elbows had faded to something pale and sad. He was reading intently. He didn't look up. She'd stood there watching him, which was forward of her, but there was something about his face, There was something calm in it. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't checking his phone every 30 seconds or scanning the street with that restless city people energy. He was just reading, completely present in his book. When he finally looked up, their eyes met for exactly 1 second before he looked back down. "Good?" she asked, nodding at the book. She didn't know why she said it. He looked up again. "Very," he said. And then after a pause, "Do you want to know what it's about?" "Tell me," she said. He did. The bus came and went, and neither of them got on it. They saw each other every day for a week before he finally asked if she wanted to have dinner. Then he'd looked immediately uncomfortable and said, "Though I should be up front, I'm between work at the moment. I can do somewhere cheap and cheerful, but I can't promise." "I know a place," she'd said. It's on me." He'd started to object, and she'd said firmly, "Thaddeus, I'm hungry, and I'd like your company. Don't make this complicated." And he'd looked at her for a second with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between amusement and something else, something deeper. And then he'd said, "All right, lead the way." She learned his story in pieces over those first weeks. He'd been a project manager for a construction firm. There'd been a contract dispute, then a legal case that had swallowed most of his savings, then the job itself had gone. He was working casual labor, painting, hauling, anything he could find. He had a small room in a shared house off Danbury Street. He was proud and quiet, and he'd help anyone who needed it without making a show of it. Not once she'd watched him spend 20 minutes helping an elderly woman load her shopping bags onto a bus. He didn't know Cordelia was watching. She fell in love with him the way you fall into cold water, suddenly, fully, and gasping. Her father found out after 8 weeks. Harold Worthington had his own kind of intelligence network. Housekeepers who passed things along, friends of friends who saw Cordelia at a market on a Tuesday afternoon with a man carrying paint-stained hands. When he confronted her, she didn't lie. She told him Thaddeus's name. She told him what Thaddeus did, or rather, what he was doing now that he was between proper employment, laboring, day work, whatever there was. Her father's face had done something Cordelia had only seen it do twice before in her life. When her mother died, and when a business deal fell through that cost him $40 million, a kind of controlled implosion, everything tight and still on the surface, and something catastrophic happening underneath. "No," he said, simply, just the one word. "Father, Cordelia, this is not a discussion. I have built everything in this house, everything in this family, to ensure that you never have to struggle. Everything. And you are going to walk away from it for a day, laborer with paint on his hands, who cannot—" He stopped, reined himself in. "I have already spoken to the Fenthorpe family. Their son, Richard, is an excellent—" "Richard Fenthorpe is a man who has never had an unkind word said to him, and therefore has no idea who he actually is," Cordelia said quietly. "I won't marry him." "Father, then I'm asking you to end this thing with—" "I won't do that either." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. The dinner was 3 weeks later. A final attempt. Her father had invited Thaddeus to the mansion, which should have been a good sign, except that Cordelia had known her father long enough to recognize it as a trap, a performance designed to expose Thaddeus as inadequate in the most comprehensive way possible. The Worthington dining room was built to intimidate. 20-foot ceilings, a table of dark mahogany that seated 16, crystal and silver that caught the candlelight and threw it back as a kind of challenge. Thaddeus had arrived in his cleanest clothes, which were presentable but plainly simple, and he'd sat at that table, and he'd been polite and measured and not once defensive. Yet Harold had interrogated him. He'd done it with the veneer of conversation, asking about Thaddeus's education, his former employment, his prospects, his finances. Each question was worded graciously. Each question was designed to cut. Thaddeus answered honestly. He'd studied business management at a state university. He'd worked in construction project management for 6 years. And yes, there'd been a legal dispute that had derailed that. And yes, he was currently working whatever jobs came his way. His bank account currently held less than $200. He was 3 weeks behind on rent. Harold had nodded at each answer with the careful courtesy of a man building a gallows. Then he'd turned to Cordelia and he'd said, "Is this what you want for yourself? This?" And Cordelia had looked at Thaddeus, who was sitting quietly. He not humiliated, not shrinking, just there, patient and steady. And she'd said, "Yes, Father, this is exactly what I want." The formal disownment happened 4 days later. Her father's lawyer had drawn up the paperwork with impressive speed. Perhaps it had been prepared in advance, which said everything about how well her father knew his own daughter. He stripped her from the inheritance. He revoked her position at Worthington and Crane, effective immediately. He gave her 1 hour to collect what she could from the house she'd grown up in. 1 hour. She'd packed quickly. Clothes, books, her mother's photograph, a small silver-framed thing she'd kept on her nightstand since she was 12, a box of her mother's letters, her laptop, some documents, 3 boxes. That was the sum of it. The gates had slammed shut behind her, and the rain had hung in the air like a question she didn't know how to answer. She thought the sidewalk was rock bottom, but she had no idea how much more the world would take from her. Thaddeus had a friend, a decent woman named Berta, who managed a small apartment building in the Caldwell district, the part of town where the streets were narrow and the buildings hadn't been renovated since the 90s. Berta had a 1-bedroom available, and she wasn't fussy about deposits, so that's where they landed. Cordelia and Thaddeus, in a space that smelled like old radiators and someone else's cooking, with a window that looked directly at a brick wall. It should have broken her. It didn't. She's going to feel that later. She's going to understand later that the first weeks in that apartment were actually the best weeks of what came next, because she was still proud of herself, still running on the heat of her own choice, still able to look at Thaddeus across a small table over a dinner of bread and canned soup and feel like she'd done something brave and right. She found work quickly enough. She had her degree. She had 6 years of experience in corporate analysis. She walked into 4 different firms in the city with her resume and her good shoes. She'd kept the good shoes. She was practical. And by the end of the first week, she had 2 calls back. And by the end of the second week, she had an offer from Meridian Capital Partners. It wasn't what she'd been earning at her father's firm, but it was solid, real, something to build on. Thaddeus was trying too. He was applying everywhere. He had some contract work lined up for the following month. And in the meantime, he was doing what he could, helping a neighbor's son with a moving job, picking up a painting shift here and there. He was never idle. That was the thing about him she kept noticing. He didn't sit with his own misfortune. He just kept moving. They were okay. Not comfortable, but okay. Then Astoria arrived. Astoria Crane, yes, that Crane, as in Worthington and Crane Holdings, was 3 things at once. Beautiful, the way expensive things are beautiful, meaning it required a lot of maintenance. and was fundamentally decorative, deeply connected to every significant piece of money in the city, and categorically incapable of sharing space with any woman she perceived as a threat. She and Cordelia had grown up in the same orbit, same private schools, same charity galas, and same fathers who played golf together and referred to it as networking. Cordelia had always managed Astoria with careful neutrality, not quite friends, not quite enemies, the way you manage a weather front. You don't antagonize it, you watch it. Astoria had wanted Thaddeus, not because she loved him, not even because she particularly wanted him, specifically. She wanted him the way she wanted every good-looking man who didn't immediately notice her. As a project, as a conquest, as a proof of something. She'd met him at one of those charity events, before Cordelia had, before anyone knew what Thaddeus really was, and she'd made her interest clear, and he'd been pleasant and unmoved, which was apparently the worst thing a man could do to Astoria Crane. When news got around that Cordelia had left her family fortune for this same man, this man who cleaned gutters for $40 an afternoon, something ignited in Astoria, something that she dressed up as concern. She called people. She had lunches. She pulled on threads. Cordelia's first day at Meridian Capital Partners was a Tuesday. It was a cool, clear day, and she'd felt good walking in. She'd pressed her blouse the night before with the small iron they'd bought from the charity shop on Nelson Street. She'd felt like herself again, or some new version of herself that she was still getting used to. She lasted 9 days. On the 10th day, she was called into the managing director's office. A man named Palmer, who had the handshake of someone who'd practiced making it feel meaningful, and he'd told her, what with the particular regret of a man who had none, that they'd be unable to continue her contract. He cited new information and compliance considerations. He wouldn't look at her directly. She asked for specifics. He deflected. She asked again. He said it was a personnel matter and handed her an envelope. She walked out into the corridor and stood there for a moment. Then she went back to her desk, packed the small number of things she'd already accumulated in 9 days, a coffee mug, a notebook, a photograph of Thaddeus she'd tucked behind her monitor, and she left. She found out about Astoria 2 days later, from a former colleague who called her, voice low, as if what she was saying might get her in trouble. Astoria had spoken to Palmer's superior, and she'd described Cordelia as unstable, a woman who'd had some kind of emotional breakdown, abandoned her professional responsibilities at Worthington and Crane under irregular circumstances, made catastrophically poor personal decisions that called her judgment into question. She'd suggested that hiring Cordelia was a risk to client relationships. She'd also taken Cordelia's position at Worthington and Crane directly, slid into it within days of the disownment, installed by Harold Worthington himself, who apparently found Astoria's ambition more palatable than his own daughter's choices. And she wasn't done. She'd made calls to 3 other firms in the city. Not aggressively, Astoria was too smart for aggressive, just conversationally, the way you mention something in passing. Oh, Cordelia Worthington? Yes, I heard she's available. I don't know all the details, but there was something. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure she'd be a wonderful fit. I just wanted to mention it because I care. That was Astoria, all soft concern over a tungsten core. The blacklisting was quiet and effective. 2 more rejections came in the next 2 weeks. Then a call that never came back. Then a recruiter who'd been enthusiastic, suddenly going cold and professional and formal in a way that said everything without saying anything. Cordelia understood. She sat on the edge of the bed in their small apartment, with the rejection email open on her laptop, and the screen light the only light in the room, because they'd turned off the lamp to save electricity, and she sat there for a long time. Thaddeus came in from outside. He'd been to a labor agency to put his name down for work, and he looked at her, and he just went and sat next to her, and he put his arm around her and didn't say anything. Because there was nothing to say. Because they both knew. She started the job search again. Different industries, different approaches. But the city was the city, and it was smaller than it looked, and Astoria's reach was longer than Cordelia had understood. Weeks turned. Money became the loudest thing in the apartment. It got to a point where dinner was bread and eggs, and then some nights it was just bread. The radiator stopped working properly, and they slept under every blanket they had, and Thaddeus still woke up every morning and found something to do, something productive, and some way to bring in something, even if it was $10 for helping someone carry boxes up 4 flights of stairs. She could see it wearing on him. He tried to hide it. He kept his voice steady and his posture upright and his humor intact. But sometimes she'd catch him at the window, staring out at that brick wall with an expression she wasn't meant to see, heavy and tired and complicated. She didn't ask him about it directly. She didn't want him to feel observed in his difficulty. She just made sure, when he turned around, that she was there. The bus station job came through a notice board at the local grocery. She didn't even have to think about it. She went and applied the same afternoon. It paid barely enough. But barely enough was what they had, and barely enough she'd take. She thought the sidewalk was rock bottom, but she had no idea, and neither did you. The Caldwell bus terminal sat at the junction of 2 unremarkable streets and handled about 40,000 people a day, most of them barely noticing the floors they walked on, which is how it goes when someone else is cleaning them. Cordelia started on the 4 a.m. to noon shift. That first alarm, at 3:15 in the morning, was a physical shock every single day for the first 2 weeks. A lurch from sleep that didn't feel like waking. It felt like being grabbed. She'd lie still for 1 second, 2, getting her bearings, feeling the cold of the room settle into her shoulders. Then she'd get up before she could think about it. She moved quietly so she wouldn't wake Thaddeus. She dressed in layers, 2 shirts under the uniform shirt they'd given her, worn thin from previous cleaners, and she'd splash water on her face and catch her reflection for just a moment in the small mirror above the sink, and she'd look at her own eyes and think something too private for words. Then she'd go. The walk to the bus terminal took 23 minutes. She timed it in the second week. She could get it to 21 if she cut through the alley behind the Costigan Street shops, but she stopped doing that because it was dark and she wasn't an idiot. The smell of the cleaning products hit her the first morning and never stopped hitting her. It was a chemical smell, sharp and alkaline, lye and bleach and industrial disinfectant. It worked into everything, into her hair, her clothes, the skin of her hands. She'd scrub at it in the shower, but it stayed in the creases of her knuckles, and she'd smell it in quiet moments throughout the day. Honey, she'd be standing in a line somewhere and catch the scent on her own skin and feel something complicated. Not shame, exactly. It wasn't shame. It was more like the physical recognition of a fact she'd chosen. She was a scrubber of tiles. She was a cleaner of public toilets in a city bus terminal at 4 in the morning. She was Cordelia Worthington, who had spent her 22nd birthday at a gala in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, who had given presentations to boardrooms full of men, who deferred to her analysis, who had a first-class honors degree and 6 years of professional experience. She was all of those things, and she was also on her hands and knees on a wet tile floor with a brush. Both things were true at the same time. She let herself feel it. That's the thing about Cordelia. She didn't perform strength. She felt the difficulty, acknowledged it in the privacy of her own chest, and then she kept moving. The physical toll was cumulative. It didn't break her in one place. It worked on her slowly. Her feet were the first thing. Her work shoes were from the charity shop, flat-soled, practical, and not quite right. By the end of each 6-hour shift, her feet ached in a deep, insistent way. Not sharp pain, more like the feeling of carrying something that's just slightly too heavy for just slightly too long. She'd get home and sit on the edge of the bed and take her shoes off and just hold the balls of her feet in her hands for a few minutes. Thaddeus bought a small bag of Epsom salts once. She doesn't know where he got the money for it without asking. And he'd draw her a foot soak without making a fuss about it. Just hand her the bowl, which was actually just a large cooking pot because they didn't have a basin. And she'd sit there soaking her feet, and they'd talk about something else entirely. Her lower back started 2 weeks in. The bending, the kneeling, the twisting. The mop was too short for her height, and she'd have to hunch slightly to use it properly, and by week 3 that hunch had become a constant ache that lived in the L4 to L5 region of her spine like an uninvited tenant. She learned to stand up slowly. She learned to hold the sink when she needed to straighten herself. She didn't tell the supervisor because she couldn't risk losing the shifts. Her hair went limp. The steam from the industrial mops and the close quarters of the bathrooms, in the constant humidity of the terminal's underground sections, it took the life out of her hair and left it flat and damp-seeming even after she'd dried it. She stopped thinking about it after a while. She braided it back every morning and put it out of her mind. At noon, when her bus terminal shift ended, she had 3 hours before the fabric factory shift started. The Leland Fabric Processing Facility in the industrial part of Caldwell was the second job. She found it through the same notice board, a scrap collection, and sorting roll, which meant she spent 4 hours each afternoon in a large, poorly ventilated room, sorting fabric remnants into bins according to material type. Cotton, synthetic, blended, unusable. The factory was noisy. The cutting machines in the adjacent room ran continuously, on a high rhythmic sound that bored into you after 20 minutes and became something you had to work around rather than hear. She wore earplugs, but they softened it rather than removed it. The foreman was a man named Gretsch, who wasn't cruel but wasn't kind. He was efficient, which meant he noticed everything that reduced output and nothing that was purely human. He'd say things like, "Pace yourself, but don't slow down," which was both pieces of contradictory advice given simultaneously. She learned to nod and get on with it. Her hands were rough by the end of the first month. The fabric was rough, some of it, and the industrial washing they'd done on the remnants made them stiff and scratchy. And she'd sort through bin after bin, and her palms would itch, and the skin at the tips of her fingers would go raw in a way that made washing dishes at home something she did with a wince. She brought hand cream in her pocket, a small cheap tube. She'd use a tiny bit each afternoon break. She had 15 minutes, sitting in the break room that smelled of microwave food and someone else's instant coffee, pressing a grain of cream into each knuckle methodically. A small maintenance of herself, a refusal to stop caring entirely. The silence of the phone was its own particular cruelty. She'd had friends, a whole architecture of acquaintance and affection built over 28 years. School friends, university friends, colleagues, the overlapping social world of a woman from a connected family. She'd expected some attrition when she walked away from her father's house. She'd expected some pruning. She hadn't expected the silence. Not calls unreturned. Not conversations gone stilted. She meant literal, complete silence. The phone didn't ring. Message requests didn't come. People who'd been in her life for a decade simply disappeared. No confrontation, no explanation, no awkward coffee where someone says, "I'm sorry, things are different now." Just the withdrawal of attention. Clean and total, which is somehow more brutal than an argument would have been. There was one voice message in the second month from a woman named Petra, who'd been Cordelia's closest friend since secondary school. It was 47 seconds long. Cordelia listened to it once, in the break room of the fabric factory on a Wednesday afternoon, on earplugs hanging around her neck, staring at the wall. Petra said she was sorry. She said she thought Cordelia was brave. She said she hoped things worked out. She said her husband's firm had business with Worthington and Crane, and she couldn't. She hoped Cordelia would understand. She said she was sorry again. She said she hoped she'd call sometime. She hasn't called. Cordelia sat with the phone in her raw, cream-softened hands, and she breathed in and out until the feeling got small enough to manage. Then she put the earplugs back in and went back to sorting fabric. There were evenings that were good. She needs you to know that, because the story of suffering is incomplete without the pockets of grace inside it, and there were those. Thaddeus made dinner when he was home before her. Whatever they had, whatever was cheapest, whatever was left. He made rice and lentils once, with 2 potatoes he'd found discounted at the end of the market day and some spices from a communal shelf in the apartment hallway that some previous tenant had left, and it was genuinely good. She'd come home smelling of lye and fabric dust, and he'd had the small table set, meaning 2 plates and 2 mismatched cups of water, and he'd lit one of those tea lights they kept in a box for power cuts, and she'd stood in the doorway for a second, just taking in the scene. "Fancy," she'd said. "I accept that compliment," he'd said, and they'd sat and eaten and talked, and she'd watched him talk, his hands moving, his face alive, and she'd thought, "This is who I chose. This is what I chose it for. Not for his station or his prospects or what he could provide in the material sense. We for the way the room felt when he was in it. Those evenings were real. The difficulty was real, and those evenings were real. And both existed at the same time. 3 months in. She's working 14 hours most days. She's thinner than she was, and her hands are permanently rough, and her back hurts every morning. And she's eating cheap bread, and she has 3 pairs of good shoes in a box that she doesn't touch because she can't afford to wear them out. And she hasn't heard from her father, and she hasn't heard from most of the people she once knew. She bought a birthday card for Thaddeus at the corner shop. The cheap ones, 30 pence, with a generic photograph on the front. She spent an evening composing what she wrote inside it. She chose every word carefully because the card itself was modest, and the words had to be enough. When he read it the next morning, he was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at her with something in his face she couldn't name exactly, but recognized as truth. "You know," he said, voice careful, "that you deserve more than this, more than I've been able to give you." "I have exactly what I want," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her for another moment. "A little longer," he said, almost to himself. Just a little longer. She didn't know what he meant by that. She filed it away with the other small things she didn't quite understand about him. The occasional expression she caught when he thought she wasn't watching. Something complex, something that looked almost like restraint. The way he occasionally went quiet around news of certain companies or business deals, then redirected himself deliberately. The way he sometimes looked at his own cheap jacket with a very specific expression. Not shame, something else. She loved him, and she didn't investigate. Some things you trust. One night, near the end of the 3rd month, the power went out in the building. Not a bill problem. Actual grid failure. Something in the whole block. They sat in the dark, with 2 tea lights and the sounds of the city outside, and Thaddeus had her feet in his lap, thumbs working into the arches, and they were just talking. Quietly, the way you talk, in the dark. He asked her, "If you could go back, to the night before you told your father about me, would you change anything?" She didn't hesitate. Not one single thing. He nodded, kept working on her foot. She could feel his grip tighten slightly, not in distress, but in something that felt like decision. Like a man who's been waiting for something and has finally decided when to act. She noticed. She remembered it later. She thought she'd seen the worst of it. She had no idea what was coming, except this time, it wasn't more loss. This time, it was the turn of everything. It started with a press release. Cordelia saw it on her phone in the break room of the Leland Fabric Factory on a Thursday morning. She was on her 15-minute break, eating half a cheese sandwich she'd packed from home, feet resting on the rungs of the chair, back already aching at 10 in the morning. She wasn't even looking for news. She'd been reading an article about something else entirely, and the headline came up in a sidebar. Thaddeus Crane returns, founder of Helix Global Consortium, ends 3-year withdrawal from public life. She looked at the name. She looked at it again. There was a photograph with the article, taken, it looked like, by a journalist outside some building she didn't recognize. The man in the photograph was in a dark suit, composed and clear-eyed, and he was Thaddeus, her Thaddeus, but standing in a way she'd never seen him stand, which is to say, he was standing in a way that suggested he'd never in his life wondered whether he had the right to be exactly where he was. She sat there with the cheese sandwich in her hand, and she read the article. She read it twice, then a 3rd time, slowly. The facts assembled themselves the way the facts do, not all at once, but in a sequence that kept forcing her to adjust what she'd understood. Thaddeus Crane. Full name, Thaddeus Alexander Crane, age 36. The founder and majority owner of the Helix Global Consortium, a privately held conglomerate with holdings in commercial real estate, pharmaceutical logistics, sustainable energy, and financial services in 11 countries. Estimated net worth, approximately $7.4 billion. 3 years prior, following the death of his longtime business partner and close friend, he'd had what the article described as a voluntary withdrawal from public business activity. He'd handed operational control to a board, stepped back entirely, and apparently spent those 3 years living as an ordinary person. The article referred to it as an unconventional personal sabbatical, with the polite bafflement of journalists who could not metabolize the idea of a billionaire choosing poverty deliberately. He was returning now, the press release said, and to resume active leadership of Helix Global Consortium, effective immediately. The key fact, the one that took longest to settle, the one that she had to sit with for several full minutes, was this. The Helix Global Consortium held majority shares in 4 companies. One of them was a commercial property group that owned the building in which Worthington and Crane Holdings operated its primary offices. A second was a financial services firm that handled a significant portion of Worthington and Crane's investment portfolio. A third was the primary logistics company that handled Worthington and Crane's international operations. And the fourth company in the Helix Global portfolio, was the Leland Fabric Processing Facility. Cordelia was sitting in the break room of a factory owned by the man she was going home to, and she sat very still for quite a long time. Then she finished her sandwich, she was hungry, and she wasn't going to waste the second half, and she put her phone in her pocket, and she went back to her sorting station. And she worked the remaining 2 hours of her shift with the same efficiency she always brought, and at the end, she clocked out, and she walked the 25 minutes home. Thaddeus was there. He was sitting at the table, not doing anything, just sitting, hands folded, looking at the door like he'd been waiting. He looked at her face. She looked at his. "A little longer," she said, echoing what he'd said to her weeks before. Her voice was level. "I'm sorry," he said. "Are you?" "For not telling you sooner." "Yes, genuinely." He held her gaze. "For everything else. For wanting to know who you were before you knew who I was. No, I'm not sorry for that." She sat down across the table from him, the same small table where they'd eaten rice and lentils by tea light. "You were testing me," she said. "Not accusation, just naming it." "No," he said, and she believed him because of how he said it. "I was recovering from something, and I needed to be a person for a while, not a figure. And I met you, and I needed to know if what we had was real. Real in the most basic sense. Not because of my name, or my money, or what I could offer you." He paused. "You had every material reason to walk away. From me, from us, from the entire situation, and you didn't. You watched me clean bus station floors," she said. "Yes." "You let me sort fabric scraps for 4 hours a day." "Yes." His voice didn't waver. And I watched you do it with more dignity than most people I've known in boardrooms. I watched you choose this." He gestured between them. "Over and over. Every day, when you could have recanted. When you could have gone back to your father and called it a mistake and been comfortable again." She was quiet. "I love you," he said. "Every version of you I've seen. And I'm sorry that version had to scrub tiles." She looked at him for a long time. At this man she'd known broke and patient and present, who turned out to have $7 billion and had chosen to sit at bus stops and read paperback novels and share bags of roasted peanuts. "We're going to talk about this," she said. "Properly, at length. Tonight." "Yes," he said. "And you're going to answer every question." "Every single one." She nodded. And then she stood up and said, "I'm going to shower. I smell like lye and synthetic fabric. And then we're going to eat something proper for once in my life. Order something. Something real." He smiled. The kind of smile that had been in him all along, she realized. That patient, warm, deep-running smile that she'd loved before she knew anything. "Yes," he said. The news moved fast. It always does. Within 48 hours of the press release, the city understood what it hadn't before. That Thaddeus Crane had been living in the Caldwell district in a shared apartment. That he was engaged, he'd proposed quietly, 2 weeks before the press release, with a ring that he'd had made from a specification he'd given during his sabbatical period. And Cordelia had said yes, in the same kitchen where she'd eaten bread and eggs for months. That his fiancée was Cordelia Worthington, disowned, formerly blacklisted, formerly a bus terminal cleaner. The reshuffling of power that followed was swift, and if Cordelia was honest with herself, more satisfying than she'd let anyone know. Helix Global Consortium's board met within the week. Thaddeus resumed chairmanship. The first order of business that was his personal initiative, rather than operational, the first thing he put forward, was a comprehensive review of all subsidiary relationships, partnerships, and personnel decisions made in the prior 6 months that had any bearing on companies in which Helix held significant financial interest. Meridian Capital Partners, which had terminated Cordelia's contract under pressure, held a funding arrangement with a Helix subsidiary. That arrangement came up for review. In Palmer, the managing director, who'd called it compliance considerations and couldn't look her in the eye, apparently had a very difficult week of meetings. Astoria Crane, who shared the family name by coincidence and distant ancestry, which is a fact she'd always found convenient when networking, found herself in an interesting position. Her comfortable installation at Worthington and Crane Holdings was directly connected to Harold Worthington's business relationships. Those business relationships ran through Helix Global Infrastructure. Helix was now actively chaired by the man whose fiancée, Astoria, had professionally destroyed. Astoria made 3 calls to Cordelia. The first was breezy and warm, the kind of call you make when you're pretending nothing happened. The second was slightly more pressured, referencing old times and shared history. The third was a text message that simply said, "I think we should talk. Cordelia, please." Cordelia read it and put her phone down and went back to the book she was reading. She was not reading it on a bus stop bench in worn-down shoes. She was reading it in the apartment. The same apartment in Caldwell, actually, because they'd agreed to stay there until after the wedding, and she found that funny and right. And she was reading with her feet up, and Thaddeus was in the other room on a call that lasted 45 minutes and involved words like quarterly yield and structural leverage that sounded like a completely different language from the man who'd spent 20 minutes helping an old woman with her shopping. Both were him. All of it was him. But Harold Worthington held out for 3 weeks after the news broke. 3 weeks of silence, which Cordelia respected as his prerogative. She didn't reach out. She'd made her peace with his absence a long time ago, on a wet sidewalk with 3 cardboard boxes. Then his company ran into a problem. It was a contract problem, specifically a renewal problem with a logistics provider that turned out, upon inspection, to be a Helix subsidiary. The logistics contract was the backbone of Worthington and Crane's international operation. Without it, they'd need to find a replacement provider within 60 days, which was both possible and very expensive and deeply inconvenient. Harold Worthington called Thaddeus's office. He was told, professionally and without hostility, that the matter would need to go through the usual channels and that the timeline for review would be approximately 90 days. Harold called again. He was told the same thing. Harold came to them on a Saturday morning. Not to Thaddeus's corporate offices, not through a lawyer, to them, to the apartment on Danbury Street. Having gotten the address through means Cordelia didn't ask about. He stood in the hallway outside their door in his good coat, and when Cordelia answered, he looked the way she'd never seen him look in 40 years of being his daughter. He looked old. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a decision he'd been too proud to reconsider until necessity forced his hand. "Cordelia," he said. She looked at him. She didn't speak. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door and let him in. Yes, she didn't smile, and she didn't make it easy. She owed him truth, not performance. He sat at the small table. He looked around the apartment, the evidence of their life here, the mismatched cups, the box of tea lights, the good shoes in the corner that she still hadn't worn out. He took it all in, and she watched him do it, and she watched something happen in his face. "I need to speak about the Helix contract," he began. "No," she said. He blinked. "Cordelia, you came to ask for help," she said. "Before we talk about contracts, you're going to say what you actually came to say." The silence was very long. Harold Worthington, who'd built a company from $40,000 and a handshake deal in 1987, who'd negotiated contracts in Singapore and Frankfurt and Sao Paulo, who had never in 40 years of business said the words out loud to anyone in a professional context. Harold Worthington looked at his daughter across a small table in a Caldwell apartment, and his voice, when it came, was rough. "I was wrong," he said. Cordelia sat with it. "I was wrong about him. I was wrong about what mattered. I was wrong about—" He stopped, started again. "I was wrong to close those gates." She looked at her father's face, really looked at it, and she found that the thing she'd braced for, the surge of anger, wasn't the loudest thing. The loudest thing was grief. For the months without him. For the call she'd never gotten. For the version of events where he'd had his pride and she'd had her family, and both things could have existed. "I know," she said quietly. "I'd like—" He stopped again. He was struggling, and she let him struggle because she wasn't going to smooth it over. Not this time. "I'd like to know if there's a way back. For us. As family. I'm asking that separately from the contract. I understand if they're not—" "They're not the same question," she said. "They've never been the same question." He nodded. "The contract," she said, "is Thaddeus's business, and you'll need to speak with him about it through the proper process. I won't influence that." Harold nodded again. "The other question," she said, and her voice was careful and measured because she'd had months to decide what she thought about this, months of cold water and lye smell and cheap bread, months of carrying her mother's photograph in the only box that mattered. "The other question is something I want to say yes to. Because I loved you even when you shut those gates. Because you're my father. Because I don't want to live the rest of my life without that connection." Harold's jaw moved. He swallowed. "But father," she held his eyes, "I need you to understand what you're saying yes to. You're not getting a daughter back who defers to your judgment on what her life should look like. That's not the transaction. You're getting a daughter who is going to marry the man sitting in the next room." Thaddeus was indeed in the next room, giving them privacy he'd offered without being asked, which was characteristic. And who made a choice she stands behind completely, and who needs you to stand behind it too. That's the condition. Harold Worthington looked at his daughter for a long moment. "I can do that," he said, quietly, like a man who means it and knows it cost him something to get here. "Good," she said. She got up and put the kettle on. Thaddeus came out of the other room eventually. He and Harold sat together for the first time since that dinner with the crystal and the candlelight, and the interrogation disguised as conversation. This time, there was no crystal. There were the mismatched cups and tea from a box of tea bags that cost 99 pence, and it was different. Different in all the ways that matter. Harold asked Thaddeus one question that Cordelia hadn't expected. He said, "Did you know, when you were sitting at my table, who you were?" Thaddeus said, "Yes." Harold sat with that. "Why didn't you say?" "Because it wouldn't have changed whether you respected me," Thaddeus said. "And I didn't want you to respect me for the wrong reasons. If you'd turn me away because of what you saw at that table, a man without current income, without a name you recognized, then I'd rather have known that clearly." Harold was quiet. Then he said, "That's a fair point. It's also," Thaddeus said, "why Cordelia will always have my complete admiration, because she made her choice looking at exactly that man, the one at your table." Harold looked at his daughter then, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're seeing them for the first time through different eyes, and whatever he found there, it was enough. Astoria was a different matter entirely. Astoria didn't get a Saturday morning in their apartment. Astoria didn't get a quiet conversation and tea in mismatched cups. Astoria got the formal review process of the Meridian Capital Partners funding arrangement, which was thorough and well documented, and the public knowledge, because these things become public, that her role in the blacklisting of Cordelia Worthington was understood and noted by the people who mattered. She didn't lose everything. Cordelia wasn't built for cruelty, and she wouldn't have wanted that, even if she'd been asked. But Astoria's comfortable position at Worthington and Crane became complicated when Harold restructured certain responsibilities, and her social footprint, which was constructed almost entirely of other people's regard, shifted when other people's regard shifted. She left the city eventually. Cordelia heard about it from someone who ran into her somewhere. She processed the information and moved on. She had too much life in front of her to spend any of it cataloguing Astoria's decline. The wedding was small. That was Cordelia's call, and Thaddeus had agreed immediately, which was characteristic. They married in a garden ceremony with 30 people, people who'd been there in the Caldwell months, the honest ones, Berta the landlady, a co-worker from the bus terminal named Suki, who'd shared break times with Cordelia without ever knowing who she was, a few of Thaddeus's oldest colleagues who'd kept his secret faithfully. Harold was there, father of the bride, with an expression on his face for the whole ceremony that Cordelia would describe later, privately, as a man learning something it took him too long to learn. She wore her hair up. Her feet, in heeled shoes that fit properly, were comfortable. The good shoes were finally being worn. Months later, Cordelia sat in an office in the Helix Global building. She'd taken a role in the consortium's charitable foundation division, her own choice, building something from scratch in an area she cared about, and she was looking out a window at the city below. The same city where she'd walked 23 minutes to a bus terminal at 4 in the morning. The same city where she'd sorted fabric scraps and listened to cutting machines through earplugs. The same city where a phone had been silent for months. She kept the hand cream, the small cheap tube or a replacement of the same brand. She'd kept buying it because it worked, and she knew it worked, and there's no point changing something that works. She kept it in her desk drawer, and she used a small amount each afternoon. A small maintenance of herself, and a refusal to forget who she'd been on the way here. She didn't regret the months in the Caldwell apartment, the aching back, the lye smell, the nights eating bread and eggs. Not because suffering is valuable for its own sake. It isn't. That's a story people tell to make sense of things that don't need to be romantic. She didn't regret it because of what she'd learned in it, which was this: she was more than where she came from. She was more than the Worthington name and the iron gates and the family crest. She was a woman who'd chosen love over legacy, who'd carried boxes in the rain and put her hands in cold water and worked for $13 an hour and still, every morning, gotten up. That was who she was. That was the ground she stood on. No one could take that. Thaddeus came to find her near 6 o'clock, much the way he always did when she was working late. He stood in the doorway of her office with his jacket over one arm, and he said, "Come on, I know somewhere good." She looked up from her screen. "How good?" "Hot food. No bread and egg contingency." She laughed. "A real one, the kind that starts in the chest." She saved her work. She got her coat. She walked out with him. Behind them, the city lights came on, one by one, across the whole long, beautiful sprawl of it. The same city, lit differently. She took his hand. He took hers back. They went to eat. Some choices looked like losses from the outside. That's the outside's problem. I still can't believe her father had the nerve to ask for a loan after what he did. What was the most emotional part for you? The bus station shifts or the final reveal? Let me know your favorite part in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.